The birth of a baby is a joyous experience in a parent's life. It's a time for hopes and dreams of the future. But for Deborah and Edward Fields, that exhilarating time was tragically cut short. On the very first night of their son's life, just hours after they brought him home, he died, and no one could tell them why. I'm Brian Dennehy, and this is Arrest and Trial.
Detective Mike Lee of the Los Angeles County Sheriff's Department normally investigated violent crimes. But it was also routine for him to be called into cases of sudden infant death syndrome to rule out foul play.
I was working the early morning desk at Homicide. We received a phone call roughly about 4:30 in the morning on a reported crib death. I responded up to Henry Mayo Hospital. I talked with various hospital personnel, and I found out that the baby was only 16 hours old when it had died, which is just unheard of as far as a crib death goes.
The infant's mother informed Detective Lee she was a diabetic.
He assured me that everything would be okay.
And that she had given birth at a private home birthing clinic owned by her obstetrician.
I started to inquire as to why the baby was born in an out-of-hospital setting to a diabetic mother, which was really a high-risk pregnancy.
It should have been absolutely apparent.
The coroner determined that there should have been no question about that baby and needed immediately to be put into a hospital situation. It should have been apparent to a first-year medical student, let alone a licensed physician. I then went back to Homicide headquarters to try to get a little bit of a background on the doctor.
With a few quick phone calls, Detective Lee learned the obstetrician who delivered the baby was Dr. Milos Kilvana, a Czechoslovakian-born physician who operated 3 birthing clinics in the Los Angeles area.
9-10 months ago, didn't you have like a...
Lee also discovered that this was not the first time that the name Milos Kilvana had made the rounds at the Sheriff's Department.
I found out from one of the fellow investigators at my unit that there was a similar case with Dr. Kilvana, approximately 9 or 10 months before my case.
The 2 cases were shockingly similar. Both infants had been delivered by Dr. Kilvana at his birthing clinics. Both had been sent home with clean bills of health, and then, within hours, died. Detective Lee visited the Board of Medical Quality Assurance and learned there was another infant who died while in the care of Dr. Kilvana.
A common thread was that they all should still be alive today had the proper intervention taken place right at the time of delivery.
Interviews conducted with the grieving mothers revealed the potential misuse of a drug called Pitocin.
Pitocin was used to induce labor. The medical board had then asked the doctor about that, and the doctor said no, he didn't use that drug. The women were mistaken, that it was only a hospital drug.
The veteran detective knew he needed a crash course in every aspect of childbirth.
I went to the Los Angeles County Medical Center, and I brought a camera with me and photographed each of the items that they thought were necessary for an out-of-hospital birthing clinic to have on hand in order to deliver children successfully.
The next morning, sheriff's deputies served a search warrant on the offices of Milos Kilvana.
I have a warrant from the Los Angeles County Sheriff's Department to search these premises.
As investigators seized medical records and other documents, Mike Lee confronted the doctor. He asked him to produce necessary medical equipment.
The first item that I asked for, the doctor brought in something It was definitely not the object I was looking for. At that time, I took the photograph out and I showed it to the doctor. I said, "No, I want one of these." He said, "Oh, I don't have that piece of equipment." And told the doctor at that time, I said, "I have pictures of everything I'm looking for." And at that point, I just started showing him photographs. He says, "No, I don't have one of these. I don't have one of these." He was confirming that he did not have the proper equipment to operate in the manner that he was, in fact, operating.
It wasn't only what Dr. Kilvana didn't have at the clinic, but also what he did have.
I discovered 53 vials of Pitocin that he had on hand at the clinic, a drug that he claimed to the medical board that he had never possessed, did not have at the clinic, and never used at the clinic. It appeared to us, based on the information that we were gathering, infants were being killed needlessly.
Detective Mike Lee was more determined than ever to put an end to the illegal and lethal practices of Dr. Milos Kilvana.
The deaths of 3 unrelated babies within hours of their births raised a disturbing question for the LA County Sheriff's detectives assigned to the case. Had the infant's obstetrician put them in mortal danger by ignoring standard medical procedures?
The mountain of paperwork seized at Dr. Milos Kilvana's office had to be diligently read and analyzed.
As we were going through the files and records, doing some cross-checking, we found 2 additional victims, women who had been delivered by Dr. Kilvana and whose babies had died.
The toll was rising, and Detective Lee could now connect Dr. Kilvana to the deaths of 5 infants.
Thank you so much, Judy.
One mother, whose baby died at the clinic, told Detective Lee of her chilling experience with Dr. Kilvana.
My baby died.
And the mother was told by Dr. Kilvana to go ahead and just take the baby home and bury it with your roses in the rose garden. Because if the authorities were to become involved in it, then the coroner's office would charge her $500 to have an autopsy done, and then they would blame the mother for the death.
Los Angeles County Deputy District Attorney Brian Kelberg joined forces with Detective Lee. Kelberg knew to secure a murder conviction, he would have to prove Dr. Kilvana was aware of what he was doing.
If we can show that he actually understood that what he was doing was very dangerous and that he acted in spite of that knowledge with conscious disregard of the dangers, then we can establish a second-degree implied malice murder charge.
Lee and Kelberg learned that Kilvana received his initial medical training in Czechoslovakia. The doctor served his obstetrics residency in New York, but never finished the program.
In the 4th year, Kilvana showed a fundamental lack of knowledge of obstetrics. The people who run the program had seen that his judgment was a serious concern.
After failing to complete his residency in New York, Kilvana relocated to Southern California.
He ended up at an anesthesiology residency at Loma Linda University. And he was assigned as the anesthesiologist to a patient who was undergoing a very low-risk operation. Nevertheless, for reasons directly related to Dr. Kilvana's failure to properly monitor the patient died.
Dr. Milos Kilvana would eventually be accepted and subsequently dismissed from 7 LA area hospitals, leaving in his wake an undeniable pattern of reckless conduct.
He knew what to do. He knew what the procedures were. It took a very short period of time that he became a person who would just do it his way, regardless of what the protocol demanded, which is the reason that he's been thrown out of every hospital he was in.
But despite his tarnished reputation, Milos Kilvana opened a lucrative birthing clinic enterprise. He eventually took on a partner, a woman named Dolores Doyle, who claimed to be a practicing midwife.
Dolores Doyle. Hi, I'm Dr. Kilvana.
Dolores Doyle was a midwife in name only. She had no license, in that field.
Okay, breathe. Okay, miss. Don't touch up. Don't touch up.
She had no formal training in the field.
Here we go. Okay, we're getting ready now. Okay, come.
She operated with the doctor, assisting in the deliveries. She was very close to, if not practicing medicine without a license, and acting as a doctor in many of the deliveries.
In October, the Los Angeles County Sheriff's Department served a search warrant at the residence of Dolores Doyle.
Dolores asked one of the officers if she could go into the restroom and was wearing rather loose-fitting clothing. The officer said, "Sure, go ahead," and was waiting outside in the hallway. Then heard what sounded to him like the top of the toilet tank being removed, and then heard a flushing noise, and then the toilet tank was replaced. When Dolores came out, the officer immediately went into the bathroom, took the top of the tank off, and found a bag full of medical records inside of the toilet tank. And there was quite a bit of incriminating evidence discovered in those records.
The investigation into the sinister practices of obstetrician Milos Kilvana had continued for more than 2 years. In that time, LA County Sheriff's Detective Mike Lee and prosecutor Brian Kellberg discovered thousands of medical documents that would reveal the doctor's darkest secret.
The documents found at Dolores Doyle's home suggested Milos Kilvana was the mastermind of an elaborate insurance fraud scheme that brought in hundreds of thousands of dollars to his 3 birthing clinics.
He had many times done insurance billings on these babies, billing for hospital procedures when they in fact had never been performed, and he could not in fact perform them.
Covering up these fraudulent billings appeared to be the reason behind the deaths of newborns entrusted to Kilvana's care.
One of the cases involved a delivery that was billed for 3 months prior to the actual delivery. Later, the baby is born and needs immediate hospitalization. The doctor knows that if I bring this baby to a hospital, it's going to expose me to insurance fraud. So the baby was sent home to die, as opposed to exposing the doctor's insurance fraud.
On October 31st, Dr. Milos Kilvana was arrested on 34 criminal counts, including 5 for murder.
Dolores Doyle?
That same day, Dolores Doyle was also arrested. She was charged with 24 criminal counts, including 2 for murder. Doyle later pled guilty to involuntary manslaughter and was released on 5 years probation.
9 babies are dead because of Dr. Kilvana.
On April 5th, Dr. Milos Kilvana stood trial for murder.
We will go through this man's entire career.
Prosecutor Brian Kellberg knew it would be a highly emotional case.
For the mothers themselves to have to go through these cases was very, very difficult. These are very gut-wrenching witnesses to put on the stand and to watch have to recount these terrible events that led to the deaths of these newborn babies.
He knew the proper procedures, he just wouldn't follow them.
Ladies and gentlemen, this is one vial of many boxes of Pitocin.
Next, Kellberg presented the 52 vials of Pitocin seized from Dr. Kilvana's office. He contended the doctor had used the labor-inducing drug as a way to make births more convenient for his schedule.
Pitocin plays a major role in the case because of its repeated use in the cases that ended up with dead babies. If you are a single practitioner and you have multiple women in labor at your office, one way to get things done is to accelerate the labor through the use of Pitocin, and that's what the evidence suggested Dr. Clavana did.
Expert witnesses testified about the high risks involved in using Pitocin.
It speeds up labor dramatically, and so you want to be in a hospital in case anything goes wrong.
Finally, the prosecution presented documents recovered at Dolores Doyle's home as proof that Dr. Kilvana let innocent babies die rather than expose his medical insurance scheme.
At the trial, the defense did not call any medical expert to challenge the opinions offered by the prosecution experts. What the defense was attempting to establish for the jury was, look at murder is just not an appropriate charge for a licensed doctor who had no intention of killing. And that at most, yes, the care was not appropriate, but convict Dr. Clavana of involuntary manslaughter.
The trial of the Los Angeles obstetrician lasted more than 9 months. 10,000 pages of documents were entered into evidence, and over 130 witnesses testified. The question of Kilvana's guilt or innocence rested solely in the hands of the jury. On December 19th, Dr. Milos Kilvana stood to hear the verdict. The jury found Kilvana guilty on all counts, including the second-degree murders of 9 babies.
Dr. Kilvana's basic attitude toward the entire investigation was some babies just aren't made to live. And he never did take accountability for any of his actions. But we solved the problem, we eliminated it, we got him off the street. He cannot hurt anybody again.
Much like one penny is the same as any other penny, I think Dr. Clavana viewed any baby as the same as any other baby. So if you lost one, you can always have another. Dr. Clavana simply didn't get it.
Milos Kilvana was sentenced to 53 years to life in prison. He is currently incarcerated at California's Atascadero State Penitentiary.
The prosecution of Milos Kilvana set a precedent. Prior to his conviction, no medical doctor in the United States had ever been found criminally accountable for the death of a patient. Because of this case, sweeping changes were made in the methods used to monitor and discipline physicians by the California State Medical Board. In one tragic night, Jennifer Wendorf lost her entire family forever. Her parents had been viciously beaten to death, and her sister Heather vanished without a trace. The search for the missing teenager would span 10 states and would eventually expose an evil cult with an insatiable lust for human blood. I'm Brian Dennehy, and this is Arrest and Trial.
Lake County Sheriff's Office detectives Ken Adams and Al Gustler heard the call come into the radio room.
I went in and called my comm center, and they advised me they weren't sure what they had, but there were some bodies. So I went ahead and responded to the scene. The deputies had already secured the residence, making sure nobody else was there and that everything was safe at that time. After I spoke with the deputies, I immediately began an interview with Jennifer Wendorf, a daughter of the victims.
A shaken Jennifer told detectives that her parents' Ford Explorer was missing, and so was her sister, Heather.
We didn't know if Heather had been possibly murdered or if she had been kidnapped or what the case was for sure. And after interviewing Jennifer, we entered the residence. The first victim we saw was the father lying on the couch. His head and face was in very bad condition. And just a quick glance at that and the way this gentleman was lying, it appeared that he never knew what hit him.
Lying near Richard Wendorf was the bludgeoned body of his wife, Naoma. Unlike her husband, there were clear signs that Naoma put up a fight. Defensive wounds were observed on the victim's body.
On examining the bodies closer, you could tell that the injuries were severe. It was what we call overkill. Somebody that wanted to do more than just quiet somebody. the master bedroom had been ransacked. There was jewelry and papers, drawers open, they were strewn all over, which at first look gave the appearance of a possible robbery.
Detectives Ken Adams and Al Gustler waited outside for the crime scene to be processed. As a crowd gathered, a witness stepped forward.
Heather's friend arrived on the scene with her mother, and she advised me that, yes, they were both going to run away with a fellow named Rod Farrell. And that with Rod, there were 3 others that she really didn't know, but she was able to give us their names.
According to the witness, Heather's friend Rod Farrell had moved to Kentucky a year earlier. There he met up with friends Scott Anderson, Dana Cooper, and Charity Cassie. The 4 had formed a bizarre cult, and they had traveled to Florida to make Heather the newest member.
Anything else you could tell me?
They're vampires.
And Janine told us that there was a thing in their group, they called themselves vampires. And there's such a thing as crossing over. They will take a new member that wants to be a vampire. The leader of the clan will take this member, and then they will split their arms and suck each other's blood. And then when Heather had left school Monday afternoon, they had proceeded to a cemetery where Rod had crossed Heather over to become, quote, a vampire.
Detectives faced a troubling question. Was Heather Wendorf a blameless victim or part of a murderous band of teenagers obsessed with the occult? Either way, one thing was certain. Investigators had to find her before more innocent blood was shed. Following up on their strongest lead, detectives issued an all-points bulletin to local police agencies for the Wendorf stolen Ford Explorer. The next day, they got a hit.
After we received a call from Seminole County, a neighboring county, that they had recovered a red car, abandoned, that was bearing the tag that belonged on the Wendorf's Explorer.
Police identified the car's owner as Scott Anderson, a member of the vampire cult. They believed that he switched his license plate with those from the Wendorf's SUV. As the search for the teenagers intensified, one of the runaway girls reached out.
The grandmother of Charity Cassie had received a call from Charity earlier that evening.
Hello?
Hi, Granny. It's Charity.
Charity had called her asking if she knew where her mother was.
Tell me when you're coming home, please.
Could you just let her know that I called?
But when the grandmother asked Charity where she was, the teen abruptly hung up. The grandmother immediately called police.
She told me that she did not get a phone number from Charity, but we continued to talk for a few minutes, and then she let a gasp out and said that she had a strange number on her caller ID, at which time she read it back to me, and I checked the area code, and it came back to Baton Rouge, Louisiana area.
Ken Adams contacted a homicide detective at the Baton Rouge Police Department and gave him the phone number.
I said that it would come from a payphone down by the river.
How long ago did they leave?
I asked him about motels in the area and suggested that they check them for our vehicle.
Patrol units began canvassing the motels in the area surrounding the phone call's origin. Within 15 minutes, their search paid off.
Dispatch of a Ford Explorer with license plate number 2 Charlie X.
Scott Anderson, Dana Cooper, Charity Cassie, Rod Farrell, and Heather Wendorf were all arrested. They were transported to the Baton Rouge police station. Detective Al Gustler immediately traveled to Baton Rouge, where he conducted interviews with all 5 suspects. First up was 15-year-old Charity Cassie.
I said, why are you questioning me? I didn't do anything.
Well, that's what we're here to find out. Charity Kesey denied everything, having any knowledge of anything, and so forth.
And I don't want to get in trouble with all of this stuff because I didn't.
He's not going to hurt you, okay?
No, I'm not scared of him. I'm just scared of what's going to happen to him. You gotta realize I love Rod more than anything. And if anything happened to him, it's...
You're not making it any worse for him, okay?
Detectives then turned to Dana Cooper, who reluctantly began to give details about the night of the murder.
When we left Kentucky, it was me, Charity, Rod, and Scott. I was the one that paid for the trip down to Florida. We parked a ways from the residence.
Dana claimed that after Heather got in the car, Rod Farrell and Scott Anderson, without explanation, headed for the Wendorf home. The next interview was with Scott Anderson.
Other than yourself and Rod, which one of the group was in the house with you?
Just me and Rod.
How did you plan on killing him?
With sticks, but then while we were in the garage, he found a crowbar.
So they found the crowbar in the garage. Scott was supposed to kill the mother, and Rod Farrell was going to kill the father. He went through the washing room area, where then he entered the family room and saw Dad, and that's where the whole thing began.
What did you go up there for?
I thought I'd be able to do something, but...
Do something? What?
Like, help him kill him.
When we got to Mr. Farrell came in, and we basically let Rod roll. He wanted to talk, almost to a point of being a braggart as to what had happened.
Okay. Went into the house. My mother was taking a shower. I was asleep on the couch, so I took the liberty of rummaging through the house and getting something to drink because I was thirsty. Okay. And Scott was following right behind me like a little lost puppy. Before Mother got out of the shower, went over to her dad and smacked the out of me until he finally quit breathing.
Rod went on to brag about what he did.
What do you want?
Come on, man, do it. Come on, hit her! Hit her!
He said when they got inside, after he killed the father, Scott froze up, so he had to kill the mother. Heather Wendorf was next. Denied everything.
No matter how big your part was or how small it was, you're the only one that can fill in that puzzle for us. And right now, it sounds like you don't want to. For whatever reason it may be.
I remember telling him flat out, don't even go near my parents.
Why would you tell him not even to go near your parents?
Because he asked me not too long ago if I wanted my parents dead or alive, and I said straight out I wanted them alive.
Heather's interview was unclear. Was she an active member of the blood-drinking cult or an unwilling victim? Following several extradition hearings, Rod Farrell and the other suspects were transported back to Florida. Even though the videotape statements seemed to be incriminating, authorities were in for a surprise. Not all of the vampire cult members would stand trial.
The vampire cult killers were finally in custody. Now it was up to a Florida grand jury to decide if Heather Wendorf was a willing participant in the murders of her parents.
Following their extradition, the 5 separate cases were passed on to State Attorney Brad King.
In the state of Florida, a capital crime, a death penalty offense, first-degree murder, can only be charged by our grand jury, which is a group, at that time it was 18 citizens of the county, who gathered together, heard the evidence in absolute secrecy, and made the determination of is there enough evidence to hold this person for this crime.
The grand jury charged Scott Anderson with first-degree murder. as well as with armed robbery and burglary. He pled guilty and was sentenced to life in prison. Charity C.S.I. was charged with armed robbery, armed burglary, and third-degree murder. She pled guilty and was sentenced to 10.5 years in prison. Dana Cooper, the only legal adult in the group, was also charged with armed robbery, armed burglary, and third-degree murder. She too pled guilty and received a 17.5-year prison sentence. Heather Wendorf's case would turn out to be not as clear-cut as the others.
We had no physical evidence. All we had was that Heather had planned to run away and that they were all caught together in Louisiana. So all of those things combined, the grand jury said that given everything that they had heard, there was no longer reason to believe that she was involved in the deaths.
Heather, come here. Heather, can you help?
All charges against Heather Wendorf were dropped, and she was released.
Heather!
Rod Farrell was charged with armed burglary, armed robbery, and 2 counts of first-degree murder. He alone decided to go to trial.
I had just stood up to begin my opening statement and had, I think, uttered one sentence of the first paragraph when Mr. Farrell's defense counsel stood up and got the judge's attention and said, "Your Honor, can we approach the bench?" Rod Farrell's defense counsel said, "Judge, I think my client intends to enter a plea of guilty to the charges, but we need time to talk to him."
Bailiff, remove the jurors.
So the judge said, "Okay, y'all can talk about it, decide what you're going to do." And actually, that process went on for most all of the morning. They came out to talk to me to find out if I would waive the death penalty, and I told them no, I wouldn't.
Rod Farrell agreed to plead guilty, but there would still be a trial. Only now, the jury would decide whether the vampire cult killer would live or die. At 16, Farrell would become one of the youngest defendants ever to face the possibility of execution. The defense claimed that Rod Farrell had suffered through years of painful abuse and should not be held accountable for his actions as an adult. His mother testified on the stand that she was incapable of raising her son and had failed to provide him with a stable home.
The defense in the penalty phase was the fact that society and government failed Rod Farrell, failed to give him help for his problems. What I did was simply point the jury back to look at what Rod Farrell did and hold him accountable for it.
But after she lunged at me, I just took the crowbar and kept stabbing into her skull. And whenever she fell down, I just continually beat her because that pissed me off. That's how I got these.
He talks about it on the tape, as if it's just another day at the store. And literally then talks about feeling the rush and the surge of energy at having taken a human life. And in my mind, those things dictated that society had an obligation to remove him from us forever.
The jury retired to carefully deliberate the fate of Rod Farrell and to decide if his troubled childhood was enough reason to spare his life. After deliberating for more than 4 hours, the jury recommended that Rod Farrell pay the ultimate price for his heinous crimes.
Rod Farrell, I uphold the jury's recommendation that you be sentenced to death.
It boggles my mind how somebody at that age can get so depraved and lose so much control at one time and take out so much anger on two people with the brutality of what he did. And seem to enjoy it.
Rod Farrell is currently on death row at the Union Correctional Institute.
Recently, the Florida State Supreme Court has reconsidered the minimum age requirement for the state's death penalty. As a result, Rod Farrell may have his sentence commuted to life in prison without the possibility of parole. when the security of a person's home is violated, the psychological damage can be permanent. Although Cynthia Tanner managed to thwart her attempted rape, she could not escape the haunting memory of the attack.
22-year police veteran Bill Nemec was assigned to investigate the attempted rape of Cynthia Tanner.
The unusual aspect about this particular case was that there was no sign of forced entry to the home. The victim assured me that she was meticulous, that she always took the time to lock her apartment, that she locked her windows, that she checked these windows before she left her house. So I was left with trying to figure out how the entry was gained.
I don't know.
He was very familiar with the victim's apartment, and it was as if he'd been in there before, as if he'd had the opportunity to go through when she was not there, go through that apartment and survey it top to bottom. When he got the victim up to her bedroom, he went right to a dresser drawer and pulled it open and had a pair of pantyhose, a pair of her pantyhose, and he was going to use that to tie her up. That was another indication to me that this person was very familiar with the victim's apartment. The victim at the time was selling her home, and she had put it on the real estate market. On the front door was a lockbox, and real estate companies put the key to the condo or the home in this lockbox. The suspect in this case, I believe, took that key out and made a copy of it and used it to gain entry to the apartment.
Nemec contacted the security company responsible for the lockbox. They produced a list of realtors who had access to Cynthia Tanner's home. Meanwhile, Cynthia Tanner had hired a private investigator to track down the man who attacked her.
The private investigator asked if he could assist in the investigation, and we agreed to help one another out.
When the private investigator talked with a man named Kurt Newman, he was met with an unusual and somewhat defensive response.
Hello? Mr. Newman was confrontational with the private investigator, refused to give any answers. His reaction to the call was so out of character for somebody who was just asking some fairly innocent questions. We at that point thought, well, it might be worth focusing our attention on this particular person, Mr. Newman.
After obtaining Newman's address, the private investigator conducted photographic surveillance of Kurt Newman. He hoped that Cynthia Tanner could identify him. When the private investigator showed the photo of Kurt Newman to Bill Nemec, he immediately realized that he had seen the face before. It was nearly identical to a composite sketch of a suspect in a series of unsolved sexual assaults. Christine Gregg of the San Diego Police Department headed the search for the elusive room-for-rent rapist.
We had a series of 5 rapes in about a year's period of time in the San Carlos area, which is a small community in San Diego. The MO, or method of operation, was very similar in all of them. The description was the same in all of them. In fact, I did composites with 3 of the victims, and they were close to identical.
Christine Gregg had spent countless hours staring at that composite, trying to identify a suspect. Then, Bill Nemec showed her the photo of Kurt Newman.
When I got the picture, I just got chills. It was him. It looked like I could have put it on top of some of the composites, and it would blend right in.
What had begun as an investigation into an isolated attack was suddenly a desperate race to stop a serial sexual predator.
Kurt Newman, a married father of 2, was now believed to be responsible for more than a dozen sexual assaults that had plagued the community during the previous 4 years. But detectives worried that Newman would be just the latest in a long line of dead ends.
San Diego Police Detective Christine Gregg had spent 4 years trying to identify and stop the room-for-rent rapist.
The victims described him as a white male, not very tall, medium height, medium build, full dark beard, wearing glasses.
But despite detailed eyewitness descriptions, the case remained unsolved. The reason was simple. The so-called room-for-rent rapist constantly changed his MO.
On the first 4, he assaulted the women at night. He'd get into their cars with a gun or a knife and force them to drive somewhere else, where he would rape them and rob them.
After a composite drawing of the rapist was distributed, the assault suddenly stopped. Then, 2 months later, the bearded, bespectacled man re-emerged. Only this time, his method was far more insidious.
He changed his MO completely, going from rapist by force at night to more of a scam rapist. He began answering ads with women looking for roommates. He'd call up, make an appointment. He would show up, talk to them for a while, and then when he was sure they were alone, he would pull out a gun or a knife and then rape them in their home.
In 2 cases, the room-for-rent rapist seemed to live out a perverted fantasy.
Ladies had advertised their wedding dresses for sale. He called them both, said that he was a producer for college plays. He needed a wedding dress for a costume and asked if he could come over to see it. They both said yes.
After he convinced one of the women to try the wedding dress on, the rapist attacked. But the cruelty often didn't stop with the sexual assault.
I know you know who this is.
On one of the cases, after he had assaulted a woman, he called her on the phone. He claimed, and this is his pronunciation, "I am omnipotent," when in fact we believe he was trying to say omnipotent. Over the 4 years, he became more violent with each rape. We knew we needed to catch him very badly because he was probably going to kill someone eventually. We went through every police file we had. We went through the registration of sex offenders. We pulled up every police contact with any male that looked anywhere near the way our suspect did. We checked everything we could. We came up with nothing.
Kurt Newman was the strongest suspect to date. Detective Gregg brought in the victims for a photographic identification.
I went back to one of the victims, showed her the photos, and she immediately said, "That is the man." She identified him without hesitation.
It's number 4.
You're sure?
That's him.
Would like me to look through them.
It's definitely number 4.
It's number 4.
I'm positive.
Eventually, 15 women identified Kurt Newman as their attacker. But the final victim, Cynthia Tanner, failed to recognize the photo, partly because her assailant had worn a mask. In her own personal effort to obtain a positive ID, Cynthia Tanner and her private investigator devised a risky plan. They paid Kurt Newman a visit.
When Mr. Newman entered the building, the victim and the private investigator followed him and actually got on the elevator with him.
Nice time.
Oh, thank you. Wife got it for me.
The private investigator took the opportunity while they were riding up in the elevator to engage Mr. Newman in a conversation.
You're on business? No, that's why here we are.
The victim was able to identify that that was him from his voice.
After being identified by Cynthia Tanner and the other victims, police arrested Newman at his office.
When I went into his office and handcuffed him, I would just want to choke him, leave him there in cuffs. Instead, I wanted to laugh. I was just so excited, uplifted, and knowing this was it for him. We had a live lineup 2 days after the arrest. All the victims we could gather up at that short notice. Every victim except one positively pointed him out as her attacker. And after the lineup, which I had videotaped, I sent it to 3 other victims who were out of state, and they all picked him out also.
But despite seemingly overwhelming evidence against him, the hard-working married father of two vehemently denied that he was the room-for-rent rapist. Kurt Newman was confident he would be vindicated. Newman had a surprising defense strategy, one that he was willing to bet his life on.
During a preliminary hearing, victim after victim took the stand and described the horrors they endured at the hands of the room-for-rent rapist. As he listened, Kurt Newman's courtroom confidence gave way to concern. Fearing the emotional impact that this explicit testimony would have on jurors, Newman waived his right to a jury trial and pled his case directly to a judge.
The burden of prosecuting Kurt Newman fell on San Diego County Deputy District Attorney Josephine Kiernan.
We went to trial on 50 counts, 50. They ranged from kidnap for robbery, which carried a life charge, to rape, to battery and false imprisonment. So we had a huge spectrum of charges.
The sheer number of attacks, combined with the assailant's constantly changing MO, would make it difficult to prove that the same man was responsible for all of the assaults. Fortunately, there was physical evidence tying Newman to at least some of the crimes.
We presented the fingerprint evidence that connected him to one of the assaults in La Mesa. We presented identification of him by a handwriting expert who identified his handwriting on a rental application that he had left at the scene of the first event. Some of the women identified his voice on the tape recordings that he had left.
Deputy District Attorney Josephine Kiernan offered the court a disturbing portrait of Kurt Newman as a man driven by a need for sexual dominance.
What the case was about, as it turned out, was primarily a man's sexual fantasies that went amok. He had an active sexual fantasy, which fits into one of the categories of types of rapists, a power rapist, or a rapist who rapes to assuage his own inadequacy, to make him feel powerful.
According to the prosecution, Kurt Newman targeted and stalked women who were beyond his reach.
It's very clear that before he assaulted them, he assessed them in some way. Each of these women was flat out beautiful in appearance. He took a look at these women and decided whether or not they met whatever his minimal criteria were for a sexual assault.
Newman's depraved fantasies did not end with the actual attack. It was as if he believed the women had been willing participants.
In some cases, he told them, the young women, just go to sleep and think it was all a dream, or act like I'm your boyfriend, things of that nature.
Having established Kurt Newman's unconscionable cruelty, Deputy District Attorney Josephine Kiernan brought down the hammer. One by one, the victims of the room-for-rent rapist took the stand.
Some were reluctant to come originally, but those that did testify, I think, felt a certain empowerment that they were part of the system and helping to make it work.
Somehow he ended up with my arm and handcuffed my arm.
It was very difficult for these women to testify. I mean, you have to think about this. In some cases, these events had been 3 or 4 years earlier.
He asked to see my wedding dress, and I put it on for him. I came back.
Very traumatic, very degrading, very humiliating experiences, very painful experiences. And yet they came forward like troopers. It was really quite an impressive sight.
We drove to an ATM and he forced me to give him my PIN number.
The women's testimony was further bolstered by a 911 tape recorded shortly after one of the attacks.
Yes, my hands are tied up again. Are you being raped or something? Yes, I'm being raped. Is the man still there? What? Is the man still there? No, I think he left. I don't know. Did he use any weapon or anything? He had a pocket knife, a large pocket knife. God, he could kill me so easy.
This is what this man listened to, time after time. This is what he was hearing. Nothing deterred him.
In a bizarre and seemingly contradictory defense, Kurt Newman claimed that he should not be held accountable for the assaults. According to Newman, the true blame should fall on the police because they failed to stop the rapist in a timely fashion.
Well, he didn't say it was him. He blamed the system for not catching the perpetrators, and yet at the same time, once he was caught, it was the police officer's fault that more victims had been traumatized because they hadn't caught him sooner.
It was unclear whether Kurt Newman's novel and confusing defense strategy held any weight with the presiding judge. Josephine Kiernan could only hope that the heart-wrenching and courageous testimony of the victims would leave a lasting impression, one strong enough to give the room for rent rapist a permanent home behind bars.
As soon as the defense rested, the judge said, "I'm ready," and she began reading the verdicts, and when I heard number 1, guilty, I was just totally blown away. I mean, it was unexpected to hear it out of the judge's mouth. And I sat there for those 25 minutes it took to read the rest, and it was wonderful.
Kurt Russell Newman was convicted on all 50 felony counts, including kidnapping, rape, and robbery. The judge sentenced him to 3 consecutive life sentences, plus an additional 281 years in prison.
The lasting image that I have is of the women who came forward, who spoke so powerfully about what had happened to them. It was a very courageous thing for many of them to do, to revisit this terrifying and humiliating portion of their lives. Had they not come forward, we would not have been able to put Mr. Newman behind bars for the rest of his life. They were the ones that did it, and that was what made me feel so good, that the system did work, and it worked very well.
Kurt Newman is currently serving his sentence in a California state prison.